My conference will deal with Jesuit education, with Catholic education as provided by Jesuits at high schools, colleges, universities and elsewhere. Now it's Jesuit education that I've deeply experienced during a lifetime of study and teaching. I don't claim that Jesuit education has proved a truly unique tradition, that is to say, the only one of its kind. But I do believe that 7 characteristics have converged to distinguish Jesuit education and make it distinctively effective in the field of Catholic and human education. I spent 5 years of secondary schooling at a Jesuit high school in Melbourne, and then 33 years teaching theology at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. There were many further experiences of Jesuit education at the primary, secondary and tertiary level, and they've contributed to this view of its effectiveness that I want to present. I think here of a lifetime of links with the Jesuit-run Newman College within the University of Melbourne. I don't want to forget participating in other institutions. They too have provided privileged insights from which to assess educational ideals, methods and goals. I think here of teaching students from Harvard University, studying in Germany at the University of Tübingen, studying at the University of Melbourne, where I received an MA, and then finally studies at the University of Cambridge, where I received a PhD in divinity. Lecturing around the world has also provided me with valuable experiences of Jesuit and non-Jesuit education in Africa, Asia, Latin America and North America, in countries like Colombia, India, Japan, New Zealand and the United States. I would argue that Jesuit education is built on 7 pillars of wisdom, 7 sources of wisdom, if you like. First of all, such education effectively encourages thinking for oneself and questioning for oneself. Then second, it tackles the history of ideas. Thirdly, it's concerned with those ideas as found in ancient and modern literature. Fourthly, learning through drama in its various forms, and that includes modern sport. And then fifthly, doing all this ideally in an international environment. And finally, sixthly and seventhly, always growing in faith and the desire to promote justice. 7 components, you might call them, 7 pillars of wisdom and of Christian wisdom. They make up a description of the educational ministry Jesuits have developed since we were formed in the 16th century. Thinking for oneself, history of ideas, ancient and modern literature, dramatic activity, learning to be formed in an international environment, and then growth in Christian faith and in the promotion of justice for everyone. When describing some movement or development in human history, I've persistently been persuaded by the example of the Greek philosopher Aristotle. He believed that the best examples and the best products of human activity, these let us know what something is about. We can more readily understand the nature of drama and great tragedy by taking up and reading and studying the Greek dramatist Aeschylus or Shakespeare. We make progress in understanding here by recalling pieces that are at the top of their field. And the same thing is true of political institutions. Aristotle thought it was good practice to assess the very best of these institutions. And they give us an idea into what a government should be doing for its citizens. We could add endlessly other examples. Aristotle's principle applies, for example, to Buddhism, we're much better off studying the best forms of Buddhism and its best products, rather than concentrating on decadent or inferior forms of Buddhism. Well, for better or worse, back in my book Catholicism, it came out in a second edition in 2014, that 400-page book set itself to look at the best examples of Catholicism. They tell us what Catholicism is about. And in doing that, I was quite consciously following the example of Aristotle. An Aristotelian frame of mind, it also encourages us to look at particular human lives that show shining sanctity, human sanctity and Catholic sanctity at its best. And I argued in that book that we understand what Catholicism is doing and aiming at much better than by concentrating on bad examples or terrible scandals that have plagued the history of the Church. I was talking some time ago about this lecture with a good Jesuit friend and about Jesuit alumni, and he immediately came up with the names of 2 Europeans and 1 American, Voltaire, James Joyce, and then Bill Clinton. Back in the 18th century, Voltaire, and a very notable alumnus of the Jesuit system, he helped to prepare the way for the French Revolution and the coming of democracy and democratic forms of government. The Irish novelist James Joyce changed the nature of literature by developing a stream of consciousness technique. It was a landmark book, just 100 years old, Ulysses, first appearing in 1922. Joyce left us with what is arguably the greatest English novel of the 20th century. And Bill Clinton, well, personally, I am very grateful to him for what he did in encouraging some settlement in Northern Ireland. And he was a product of the Jesuit University, Georgetown in Washington, D.C. Well, all power to Voltaire and James Joyce and Bill Clinton, but we might want to look elsewhere for outstanding, shining products of the Jesuit system. We might want to look, for example, at Matteo Ricci, an Italian who died in the early 17th century. We might think that looking at Ricci and others like Friedrich von Spee of the 17th century and Baron Pierre de Coubertin, who died in 1937, these might give us a chance of identifying the kind of alumnus that Jesuit education has aimed at producing. I mean, all part of Voltaire, Joyce and Clinton, and they certainly embodied some Jesuit ideals, the power to question and think for oneself, for example. They were internationals and they practiced drama in different ways. But there's more to be said, I think, about what Jesuit education can produce than what we see in the cases of Voltaire, Clinton and James Joyce. Think of Matteo Ricci. He was a Jesuit humanist who found himself with a very radical respect for Chinese culture. He shaped his ministry and his choices there in China as a Catholic priest, extraordinarily respectful of that great Chinese culture. He died and was buried there. And a very different example, a little later, Friedrich von Spee. He had a fierce desire to practice truth and effect justice. And he was doing that in the midst of a system that persecuted witches. The Catholic and Protestant rulers of Germany at that period, they accepted the reality of witchcraft and were very open to torturing and executing witches, mainly women. Incidentally, the Spanish Inquisition didn't think there was such a thing as witchcraft, and they refused to hear alleged cases that were brought against so-called witches and warlocks. But in Germany, the so-called epicenter of the persecution of witches in the 17th century, there it flourished. And there it was that Friedrich von Spee made his stand, which effectively helped to eliminate, finally, the dreadful persecution of witches. And then finally, in the 20th century, Pierre de Coubertin, he was a French nobleman who developed his qualities and values at a Jesuit high school in Paris, Ignatius College. And he was the one who revived the Olympic Games, which first took place in modern times in 1896 in Athens. And he was inspired to do this by his Jesuit master of classics. So what about de Coubertin as someone who embodied ideals and values that let us see something of what Jesuit education is about? As an alumnus of Xavier College, Melbourne, I hear the language of de Coubertin echoed in our motto. We still have today his ideals of doing things citius, altius and fortius, more quickly, higher and stronger. The Jesuit school I went to in Melbourne, founded in 1882, it adopted as motto, sursum corda, lift up your hearts. And you do that by going faster and higher. It may be just an accident, but I find a curious convergence of the Jesuit ideal of education, sursum corda, lift up your hearts, and those new ideals for the revived Olympic Games in 1896, brought about supremely by a Jesuit alumnus inspired by one of his masters. De Coubertin died before the Second World War began. Can we risk naming names of people who lived after his period? Jesuit alumni that we would be proud of and who embodied in different ways the values that they had absorbed during their years at a Jesuit college or university. We might think here of Henri Nouwen, the Dutchman, died in 1996, or Bing Crosby, the American singer and actor, who died in 1977, and then Luis Buñuel, a Spaniard film producer who died in 1983, and also too of Alfred Hitchcock, an English film producer who died in 1980. Through his writing and lecturing, Henri Nouwen met the spiritual needs of a generation of people. He had an extraordinary capacity to see what the issues were for modern, at least Western, Christians and others. Bing Crosby was a very popular singer and actor, and he was the alumnus of Gonzaga College in Oregon, United States. But as a person working in the film, in the area of media and films, of course, his name is eclipsed by Hitchcock and even more by Buñuel. Luis Buñuel is often considered the most distinguished and influential filmmaker of all time and was a Jesuit alumnus. Another tempting way of evaluating the products of Jesuit education would be to look at a specific Jesuit university or other institution, and you can see, or could not, or would hope to see, the alumni embodying in their lives the ideals that Jesuits taught them at school. I cheat a bit here by thinking of the Gregorian University in Rome, which the mother university of the Society of Jesus, founded in 1551, and the Gregorians had an extraordinary record of producing, for example, popes, right down to John Paul I. He will be beatified on the 1st of September this year. So since it was founded in 1551, the Gregorian University has produced 16 popes. Well, what about saints? How was it done when we moved the focus from papacy to sanctity? The high school I attended in Melbourne for 5 years as a boarder enjoyed among its older priests Father William Hackett, an Irishman. I treasured the wisdom, the spiritual wisdom that he inculcated quite often by quoting classical writers. He assured the boys one day that in the evening of life there is no greater joy than to have loved Jesus Christ. And Father Hackett summed up his ideals as those of becoming a scholar, a gentleman, and a saint. So by the Hackett standards of sanctity, what would we say about the Gregorian University? Well, it's done pretty well there. It counts among its alumni at least 24 officially canonized saints and over 50 who have been raised to the altars by being officially declared blessed. Take, for example, that modern martyr who means so much to people, especially in the Latin American countries, Oscar Romero. He studied at the Gregorian for 5 years, from 1938 to 1943. And in life and in death, Romero has become the voice of people who suffer by being tortured and, well, murdered en masse. One's very proud of Oscar Romero among the ranks of old boys of the Gregorian University. And especially in modern times, that Jesuit university has repeatedly come up with martyrs. I think here of Blessed Titus Brandsma, who was killed in not Auschwitz, but Dachau. I think he spent time in Auschwitz, but his death occurred in Dachau. And then a religious woman, Maria Lutz Trevino, who was martyred in Mexico, and a couple of Jesuits. Patrick and Innocent were two Africans who were martyred on the first day of the genocidal massacres in Rwanda in 1994. They'd been running a centre of reconciliation between Hutus and Tutsis. And there were others too, like Paolo Dell'Olio, a big Italian who patiently did wonderful work at a centre for reconciliation between Christians and Muslims in Syria. He was kidnapped and apparently killed by ISIS in 2013. It's daunting and humbling to think I had the chance of teaching some of these people and sharing in the great grace of their martyrdom by proxy, so to speak. The older you get, and I've reached 90 years of age, the more friends and relatives you lose through death. And in last year, 2021, my last surviving sibling, my beloved sister Maeve, died, and other friends, and not least Sir James Gobbo. He was someone with whom I became a friend back in 1944 when we began our 5 years of being boarders at the Jesuit College, Jesuit High School, Xavier College in Melbourne. Now, Jim Gobbo, he always struck me as someone who put flesh and blood on the ideals for Jesuit education, and he more than deserves to be recalled as a shining example of what Jesuit education hopes to achieve. Jim's parents, they migrated to Australia, and he was born in Melbourne on the 23rd of March 1931. The Gobbo family then returned to Italy, but fortunately, after Jim had spent a number of years home in Italy, they came back to Melbourne just before the Second World War opened. They lived right opposite the Queen Vic Market in Melbourne and had the honour, privilege of introducing espresso coffee. I think the Gobbo family were the first in Melbourne to sell coffee using the latest, rather large machines that were available then for producing espresso coffee. And then Jim and I became boarders at Xavier College in 1944. But he'd already come under the impact of Jesuit education. As a small boy during the Second World War, he attended illustrated lectures on Dante that a Jesuit provided in Melbourne for younger and older Italians. And Jim never neglected the Divine Comedy and the lessons about life and the hopes that wonderful Italian work presented to us, about climbing towards the glory of God, God who moves the sun and the other stars. I never asked Jim this question, but I sometimes used to think that his wife of over 50 years, over 60 years, Shirley, she was, so to speak, Beatrice to Jim, that she led him from hell and purgatory to the paradise of God and all that that entailed. There's a case for us thinking of Jim's life that way as sort of exemplifying also some things of the values that Dante immortalised in the Divine Comedy. At Xavier College, he met an overwhelmingly Irish-Australian environment. Jim joined that small group of boys who come from elsewhere. There was a few boys who were English or Italians, Jews, one or two Americans or Canadians caught in Australia by the outbreak of the war. On their side, they provided the other boys with a glimpse of the wider world, and they themselves necessarily faced an international environment that gave them constant room for thinking things through. To give one concrete example, towards the end of his 5 years at Xavier College, Jim noticed that the Archbishop of Melbourne, Dr. Daniel Mannix, awarded each year a substantial prize in Irish history. So research in that branch of history allowed Jim to compose the required essay. When he won the prize, Dr. Mannix was astonished to find himself handing out a prize in Irish history to someone called Gobbo, who was clearly from northern Italy. As an exemplary product of Jesuit education, Jim could think about things and decide to do things for himself or for ourselves. In our final year at Xavier, Jim and I had been studying informally the classical languages. We'd been studying them formally, and we'd gained through that literature a considerable knowledge of Roman history. Why don't we sit for the examination in Roman history, Jim said. So we did that, even though it wasn't a prescribed subject and not available at the school. Jim received a first-class honour, and I got a higher second. We learned and practiced Jesuit and what you might say are humanist values by also making up teams for debates within the school and debates with boys from other schools, and learning to marshal arguments and use language effectively in the debating situation. That prepared the way for Jim to eventually become a leading barrister and a Supreme Court judge in the state of Victoria. He was to turn down an invitation to join the High Court of Australia and move to Canberra. Jim thought that would put an unfair burden on his dear wife Shirley in bringing up the children, and it wouldn't benefit their education as he hoped to do. The senior boys at Xavier also belonged to the St Vincent de Paul Society, kind of small junior branch of it, and the members occupied themselves sometimes with visiting the sick and the dying at the Caritas Christi Hospice in Kew. We showed up also to play with dozens of emotionally deprived little boys at a nearby orphanage. And then after the Second World War ended, boys at the school, we put together food parcels, mainly canned goods, and sent them to Europe where so many people were hungry and even starving. I'm not saying that that experience at school simply led straight to what Jim did later, but in a sense it's true that the child is a father to the man, as people used to say, that he learned a willingness to help others, sometimes people that he'd never met, never would meet, thousands of miles away in Europe. When Jim entered solidly into his career later, he helped found the Immigration Reform Group, and he advocated the abolition of the White Australia policy. And in 1973, he was appointed to the Federal Immigration and Population Council, and through that work he tried to overcome public prejudice against people who had arrived by boat. Jim went on in 1982 to found the Multicultural Task Force. In 1987 he set up the Australian Bicentennial Multicultural Foundation. As you can see from just some of these milestones in his history that I've recalled, Jim set out to produce a much happier multicultural Australia. He picked up something of that at school and it flowered extensively in his later life. The 5 years at Xavier College as a boarder finished with a bang when he was rowing in the senior boys 8. They won at the head of the river. First time a Xavier first crew had done that after the Second World War. And Jim went on to row at Melbourne University, win a Rhodes Scholarship, and then studied law at Oxford University. He was to row in the famous Oxford crew that beat Cambridge at the legendary 100th boat race in 1984. Well, home in Melbourne, the crown of this extraordinary career would come when he served as Governor of the State of Victoria from 1997 to 2001. All through that time, I never heard Jim sort of come up with talk about his being entitled to this or entitled to that. He was an extraordinarily humble person. He was grateful to those who'd helped him along the way, and himself he was very, very humble. And after he died last November, a former master of Geelong Grammar School, as it was, wrote to me, and he expressed how astonished he'd been at the humility of Jim. Jim Gobbo was an extraordinary human being, but most impressively through the power of his humility. Well, when I returned to live in Melbourne, come away from Rome and moved back in Melbourne in 2009, I found that one of the daily newspapers had promoted instigated two independent inquiries into a multicultural Italian organisation that Jim led. And there was an accusation there of misusing funds that should have gone elsewhere. So the Charities Commission and then a police fraud squad, they examined all this, and both of them, quite independently, said there was simply no case to be answered. There was simply no case to be answered. Millions of dollars of public money being spent on a wild goose chase, and this had been encouraged by one of the daily papers. Well, I urged Jim, why don't you bring a case for defamation against that paper? But Jim had other things on his mind to do, and he shrugged his shoulders and went back to what he was doing for homeless people, for hungry people, for the old, for palliative care and the rest. For better or worse, I wrote up the story in the third volume of my autobiography, From Rome to Royal Park. But it was typical of Jim, simply not interested in vindicating himself or his name, not interested in bringing what I thought was a clear case of defamation, but just going about what he deemed to be the most important things he could spend his life on. This lecture's presented 7 leading values that are endorsed by Jesuit education, embodied in it. Taken one by one, of course, you find these ideals elsewhere, but taken together there's something distinctive. It's not meant to be a complete list, but at least Jesuit education would want to do these things, from teaching boys and girls to think for themselves, to question for themselves, then right through to pursuit of justice and the growth in faith. And through their colleges, universities, and other institutions, Jesuits have constantly encouraged these values. And I thought it might be a useful exercise to pick someone notable who died in this part of the world. Sir James Gobbo, retired Governor of Victoria, and an alumnus of a Jesuit high school who really lived out in his life the shining examples of those ideals. Well, through this lecture, some of you may be thinking of the example I've avoided examining, namely Pope Francis. Pope Francis is a product of Jesuit education. And do my 7 values shine through Pope Francis and his ministry and teaching? And does he establish anything clearly about the excellence of Jesuit education? Well, I leave that to yourselves to decide. Thank you very much.